Once again, good morning to everyone. Welcome to the second day of this symposium. We have the whole morning for us to discuss on the results from yesterday, the results of the 3 parallel sessions, and to make some conclusions in order to make steps towards our final destination. This is to reinforce the guidelines and to go for the implementation indeed. And before we proceed with the common discussion, and before I present you a suggestion for today, I would like to briefly introduce our second keynote for today. The keynote will be held by 2 persons from the European Commission. Irina Reyes is sitting with us today, and Marco Gema is sitting in Brussels. And we really hope and we're convinced that the technical connection will be today definitely better than yesterday. Anyways, open access in the European policy context, climate research in perspective. Just some words on the speakers. Irina Reyes and Marco Gema work at the European Commission within the Directorate General on Research and Innovation. Irina Reyes is a policy officer and has been involved in the Science 2.0 consultation she presented yesterday in the parallel session 3. And Marco Gema is also a policy officer, and his focus is on the topic on climate action and Earth observation. And maybe it's relevant to mention that his section represents the European Commission at the JPA Climate Governing Board. So, Irina and Marco, the floor is yours.
Do we have Marco with us?
Okay.
Okay. But maybe I can start. I was asked to give a general presentation on the Commission's open access policies, both for publications and data. And then the idea is that Marco will come in and focus more on open access and in climate research and the experience he has there. So mine is quite general one, and we'll go through it now. So I would like to start off with our commissioner, Carlos Moedas, who in June this year quite bravely announced his priorities, 3 policy priorities as part of his new open agenda. And those priorities are open science, open innovation, and open to the world. This is a whole discussions per se, but what I want to emphasize here is that he and we put open access as a core part of open science, but it's not only about open access. Yesterday we talked a lot about that, about rewarding, about evaluation criteria, but I think this quote, for us it's important because our top leadership is on board and pushing for it. And you might have heard last week when he made a statement towards publishers, asking them to really start adopting their business models. And we hope that we can push a little bit more on that with the Dutch presidency. We also mentioned yesterday Leroux's statement or petition, so it's really a momentum right now. Let me see. So why open access? I think it's pretty obvious. It's been no need perhaps to defend it so much, but as you know, open access, we've been promoting this already from FP6, FP7, and now in Horizon 2020. Why? Of course, it's about publicly funded research, and that needs to have more impact and more reusability. One way to get there is open access. And our objectives has been quite far now in ERA, but also beyond. Also something that we touched upon in yesterday's discussion. I think if you want to know more, these are like the 3 key documents to read if you want to study more. It's our 2012 communications. The most important, I would say, is this one, and along with the recommendations toward better access to scientific information, and the recommendation on access to preservation of scientific information. That one is quite concrete and has also targets, 60% target that I will come back to. But okay, this was 2012. What happened in these 3 years in between? Right now, again, I want to mention what is happening this year. In May, in the Competitiveness Council, member states really expressed a wish to develop a European open science agenda. And this is what we are working on together with stakeholders. The Council conclusions, which you can download, calls really for more actions to remove obstacles to both publicly funded publications and their underlying data. So they ask the Commission to do more on that, to step up, I would say, a bit more. And also welcome the pilot on open research data under Horizon 2020. It's a pilot, but this is a clear message that it's in the right direction as a funders. So what are we doing as funders? In Horizon 2020, you have the regulation and a specific article on open access, which is quite a big step compared to FP7, where it was encouraged. But here it's mandatory for publications, peer-reviewed publications. Open access should be ensured for those. And open access to research data should be promoted. Okay, the wording is not as strong as for publications, but it does give a signal that it should be promoted, but there are different ways to do so. So again, what are the differences compared to from FP7 to H2020? There is an obligation to provide open access to publications. You can choose, we don't say green or gold, up to the consortium and its partners there. Gold open access costs are eligible for reimbursement as part while the project runs, but we are aware that there are costs after the project ends. This is an issue. And right now we have a call open, if you don't know about it, where if you have been an FP7 project, or FP7 right now at least, if you want to have a post-grant for your open access costs for the publications produced there. It's a call open now under the Open Air project. Open Air Portal is, if you haven't seen it, go and see. They collect all open access publications from all repositories, and they're also going now beyond for data as well. Again, a EU-funded project. And of course, in the guidelines, authors are encouraged to retain copyright and grant licenses. I think we have Marco there now. A little bit, we discussed that again yesterday. So are we monitoring what's going on so far? So far, because FP7 is still continuing, we have projects who were signed last year. So far, it's 42% of all scientific peer review publications in FP7 that are in open access. The goal in the recommendation I just mentioned is to reach 60%. I think last week when we checked, the percentage was 54. So I think we will definitely reach that by 2016. That's just for publications. Very short on the pilot that I mentioned. There are extensive guidelines on that and also what it is. I tried to summarize it in one slide. So it's a pilot. Why? Because it doesn't apply to the entire Horizon 2020 and all its work program parts. There are selected work program parts that explicitly said we want to be in the pilot. We want to ask our projects to grant open access, to have open access for their research data. So it's so far 8 work program parts. You know, recently the work programs were published. So for 2016 and 17, we have 8 work program parts participating, Climate is one of them, of course. What data should be open access? We call it the underlying data, so the data needed to validate a publication. So if we have the publication, the data that's needed to really recheck it and validate it. So far it's just the underlying data that we ask to be open access. Up to the consortium to choose the repository of their own choice. It's nothing we say. We do have some suggestions, but it's really up to them. Important, the data should be accessible, should be easy to mine it, and readable. This has to be ensured. And there also has to be information for others to read and to find what tools are needed, if there is a special software, and of course it should be no cost for others to use that data, so at no cost. And novelty, I would say a bit inspired both from UK and US, is that we ask the consortium project to have a data management plan. But we don't ask it from the start, as we are aware that that's quite an extensive thing to do, and success rate is not so high. So for now, we ask for those projects that are awarded, 6 months after the project has started, they have to submit a data management plan, which is not a static document. Of course, it's updated as the project goes. This is new for many of my colleagues as well. We have last year's the projects that were signed, so now the data managements are coming in. It's both new for some beneficiaries and for my colleagues, and this is really a learning process. Of course, I also mentioned that those work program parts that participate in the pilot, for those projects there is possibilities to opt out. So it's not mandatory, of course. They can opt out and say, no, look, we have most of our data is personal data, we can't do it, for IPR reasons as well. So there is always a room for that. Uptake of those 8 parts, 14 and 15 that were part of the pilot, 65% participate. You can turn it around and say, of course, 35 opt out because of several reasons. And other work programs that are not part are so far only 12% wants to take part in the pilot. Like, for example, the health work program. It's one which we so far have applicants are not opting in. And yes, I was very short on the pilot, but I think I leave now to Marco. Don't know if you see the slide, Marco. It's open access knowledge and climate research. Do we need it? This is, yeah. Can you hear us?
Okay, thanks. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Irina. Can you hear me? Okay. So this is not only our first presentation in this setup, it's also our rehearsal for the presentation. So I think it worked out quite well. And thanks, Irina, for presenting what the European Union is doing on this open access and sharing of knowledge. And so I'm stepping into climate research, which is a very special area because you need many different data sets. And of course, it's a global challenge, and we have a global funding community behind the climate research. So it does not only mean the European Union with the research has to work on open access, it's also a requirement to communicate with other donors worldwide to harmonize the process. So this is, to take it up front, it's a process we are in for climate research, and we are not at the end of the line, and we simply started. But I started with this slide just to ask some questions. Do we really need open access and knowledge in climate research? And of course, we are also in the JPI Climate working on climate research. Yes, of course, nobody would doubt it. And this open access, it's more than publications or the data, it's on the modeling. What would the Ipcc IPCC process be without open access and knowledge? Imagine an IPCC-like process without the intercomparison projects we have on the global scale. Where would we have our assessments from? How could we compare the different models we are running? This is only possible because in the last 10 years there was a lot of cooperation to share the different models, to have the projections together at one server. We would not be advanced in the climate research as we are today if we didn't have this intercomparison of models, exchange of data. And of course, there's a long way to go. And this brings me to the second point I'm mentioning here. Who would really want to pay for climate projections that are publicly funded? And here I make a step to the next slide that you cannot see yet. We had a teleconference with GFCS, the Global Framework on Climate Services, yesterday with different UN agencies and with WMO. And it became very clear in some countries we do not have open access to data, and the let's say national hydrological meteorological services, they are charging like recovery cost for providing the data. But this is a big burden, I can say already. But I mean, when we say how to use these projections, who should pay for it? Because they are publicly funded, and all our Horizon projects are publicly funded. And of course, we would expect them to have an open presentation of the results at the end. On the data, it's a completely different topic, and this will be then in my next slide. But I mean, just to continue with the third bullet point, where would climate science be without the large data sharing projects? Would we really know about the teleconnections in the climate system? And climate research is more than precipitation. Pardon? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So where would we be? Because climate research, it's more than precipitation or temperature. It's the land data sets we need to have, the ocean data, the soil data, the data on the hydrology, the cryosphere. I mean, there needs to be a very big exchange network, and this has been established for the National Meteorological Hydrological Services through the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization. However, there is a lot more to do. A good example we are working on in the broader field of climate research is the cooperation on the group on Earth observation, which is applying a strict and complete open data exchange. But I mean, coming maybe now to the challenges. So if you could skip to the second slide. I have a cat sitting here. I'm sorry. These things can happen, huh? So did you open the second slide? Open access and knowledge in climate research, do we really need it? Yeah. So it starts with a big red but. You know, the climate services roadmap we have launched in March this year has looked into different challenges how to develop the climate services market, not only in Europe, but also worldwide. And we have asked experts to really dig into different topics, what is hampering the uptake of climate services. And this, of course, includes the science of climate services and climate research in general. I mean, the next point I'm showing here is about the examples of limitations we have seen for the market uptake of climate services. And this is very much related to the open access and the open knowledge. So if you see the first bullet point, the infrastructure, we all want to share data, but somebody needs to really compute all of these data in order to make them available. We need the data and the information technology behind our underlying research to be able to share them. We have a huge infrastructure that needs to be developed, especially when we are running the large modeling projects. Because it's not very simple to run the modeling projects. Climate research was often hampered in the last 20 years by limitations to the modeling capacity. But who could really deliver and support the access of these climate services and climate research in general? And who would pay for this infrastructure after the project ends? And this is one limitation in climate research. As long as the project is being funded, we can apply different open access policies. and we can have voluntary commitments for the sharing. But what happens once the project ends? So we need to have additional projects that are really taking care of the IT infrastructure to provide these data, to provide a platform that these data can be exchanged. I mentioned in the slide before, it's not only the precipitation, temperature, and air pressure. The land data sets, all of these different data sets needs to be available, and somebody has to pay for the infrastructure. And then there is the question, of course, there should be open access to the results, but can we charge really fees to provide them and to pay for the infrastructure? I will come in the next slide to how we are going to solve this problem. Standards and credibility is another problem. The data quality and assurance. If we collect data, how can we make sure that the data we are sharing are of good quality? The data need to be processed. If we did this in a research project, it's guaranteed it has been done. But what about data sources that are not coming from scientific projects and that are not coming from the National Hydrological or Meteorological Services? Because we know we have private measuring networks and private providers of information. For instance, along the coastlines, we have private companies providing services to farmers, connected with a mobile phone application for early warning. So how can we make sure that anything that is available is also of a good quality? And what is the legal access? How can we exchange and integrate these different data sets? For one solution could be here going through the Global Framework on Climate Services, for instance. But then we come back to the first point: who would pay for an exchange of this data if we have to integrate different sources of data and to really check what is the legal aspects of involving these data that have been maybe funded by different funding sources? So coming to the third bullet point, the liability for limited, open, free access to data, information for services supply. What happens if we do a forecast? Or let's say a forecast would be easier. Let's say the tricky part, the projection, and we say you have open access to our projections, and we project in one city, for instance, no changes in hydrological extremes or hydrographic extremes, and then there is a big flooding coming. Who is liable for this kind of information if we use the open data for a projection and maybe sell it as a climate service? Also here, there needs to be done a lot about the liability of all the different information that is provided. And coming also to the last point, IP implications by mixing the different sources, the different customers, and the commercial aspects. In Horizon 2020, it's very clear how we are dealing with the different open access, and the consortia have to sign agreements how to deal with IP issues. For instance, if a patent is being developed. But if we mix different data sources, and imagine we have a provider of climate services that is using a mix of different publicly available open access data with some other information and some maybe restricted information on demography, on projections of the economy, who is at the end owner of the projections being made by this company? So this is something we really still need to look into when we go from the climate research to the climate services side. And this is a very important aspect we are dealing with in Horizon 2020 now. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So what are we doing in Horizon 2020 to overcome all of these barriers and these questions that have been introduced by the Roadmap on Climate Services? You are very well aware in the JPI Climate about the Aeronet Co-Fund Action for Climate Services that will start the next February. I know that some of the projects that will be launched there are dealing with different aspects also of the challenges I have just presented. And this is a challenge that cannot be done in Brussels itself. This is a reason maybe why the JPI Climate also looks into different member states, into some case studies. What happens if we are mixing different data sources that go beyond the climate research domain? Another instrument we have here, I mentioned briefly, ECOMS, the Coordination Action for Climate Services and Earth System Modeling. So this is a project we have just started. It's a 5-year coordination and support action where we can really follow some of these grand challenges in the open access for climate research, and we will have more opportunities in the coming years to sit together in the setup of the JPI Climate with our colleague Irina, with new numbers and percentages maybe on the overall horizon, and to see how are we on a good track for the climate research, because there are many things to be done. We started now in Horizon 2020 to tackle step by step the different parts for the climate research, and I'm sure that by continuing with this research on the open data access and policy, we will run into much more challenging problems maybe, or new experiences. And of course, we have to exchange with the other donors that are working on climate research. Last meet I met the NASA and the NOAA, the European Space Agency. There's many people involved in providing data, also free of charge, but how to integrate them, this is what we will do in these two large research and innovation projects we have just started funding in Horizon 2020. I think when we're getting back together next time, we know more about this one. So I think the next slide would then be for Irina again.
Thank you. Yes, the next slide is way ahead for the bigger picture, for general policy on open access. I just wanted to give you some pointers, what we see for the next coming years. Of course, monitoring open access in FP7 and Horizon 2020, especially in Horizon 2020. I would also mention that we have the ex-post evaluation on FP7 coming out soon, and the midterm review of Horizon 2020 next year, where I think there will be more focus on open science. How is open science and open access tackled in Horizon 2020 so far? We also know that we have to provide more support both for beneficiaries and for our own project officers on the pilot, on the implementation of the pilot. There is also a serious discussion on the development of a European Open Science Cloud for research data across all scientific disciplines. And I think also we will look more into mainstreaming open access as funders across Europe. And one of the reasons why I'm also here is that we also need to work more with other ERA stakeholders, such as the GPIs and EITs. It's not just Horizon 2020 projects. Yeah. I think we have questions, time for questions, discussion. What do you say, Alexis?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you, both of you, Marco and Irina. And it's time for questions. I see one.
Yeah, I think this is a question for Irina. So I'm kind of in the publication phase of a FP7 project that started before 2012. But I think from your slides, maybe I got that we could still ask for money to make our publications open access?
Yeah, I clarify. This is for those projects, FP7 projects, which have ended, not for the ongoing ones. In the ongoing ones, you are supposed to budget for that as well, if you haven't done it already.
Even if it started before this 2012?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So all EU projects are supposed to be open access?
In FP7, it was an encouragement.
Oh, okay.
But it was not mandatory.
Okay.
So for those who did it anyway, but and the project has ended, they can apply for this post-grant.
Okay.
If you want a bit more detailed answer, I suggest to the RTD functional mailbox on open access, because these colleagues there really follow this call that is open right now under open air.
I'm sorry.
There are a lot of links. This is just a functional mailbox up there of open access. So it's all kind of questions and feedback.
Great. Okay. And then second question
yes.
too. So all Horizon 2020 proposals are supposed to have a data management plan as well?
Not proposals, running projects. So when you submit your proposal, we don't ask for a data management plan. We do ask you to describe how you're going to manage data in general. But if the project is awarded and you're participating in the pilot, then we ask for a data management plan after 6 months. We thought that it would be too much of an administrative burden to ask for it at the application, at the start of the application. I know that in the US, it's asked for when you apply. But then it's really taken into account also under the evaluation criteria, which is not right now.
Thanks.
There's one more question.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about this pilot action on open access. It's only including the data, also, I guess that it will include also the metadata associated to this data, and also if you have any plans or if you have considered to include also the software. Because yesterday in one of the topic discussions, it said that of course the software is paid by public money, so it also should be open access, and sometimes the data doesn't make many sense if you don't see the methodology and how it was the results of that project came to. Thank you.
If you have used the software and others need that software to access, yes, that it has to be also made available. But for other associated data, so far we don't ask for it. Of course, it's up to each project to decide, and that's what you state more in detail in the data management plan, which data and not where and which tools you use, others have to use.
So, otherwise...
Yes, okay. For Marco, no question? Now that you have him here listening.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so again, thank you very much, both of you, for this interesting talk. And yeah, we'll try to keep in mind these specific issues on the open access in general and the vision from the European Commission, and also to the climate research related aspects in during the rest of the day today. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco.
Thanks, Irina. Thanks, Benedict.